I started out working on the inner city streets of Sydney with homeless people who were sleeping rough. I just see extraordinary potential in all people, just not the same level of opportunities. And so that's been my purpose for all of my working life and my voluntary life. People often think that there's a secret sauce or there's a special X factor required in leadership.
What do you think measures to define poverty and how is it limiting or not limiting?
There's about 700,000 children in Australia that are in households that are in low incomes or experiencing poverty. A young person who experiences poverty is 3 times more likely to be an adult who experiences poverty unless they get the right support at the right time.
I think people like you and me we had the opportunity to have the entry-level roles.
Yeah.
And we had our manager.
Yes.
So I had my manager who would tell me this is wrong, this is right. The young people who are coming in who might not have that traineeship or internship opportunities.
44% of the students that we support don't have access to a digitally connected laptop at home. And so that's another dimension to poverty. Every dollar you spend in the first 5 years of a child's life has a $7 payback over time in terms of ultimate benefit. We need more young people participating in the economy and in society.
Before we get started, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode of our cutting-edge contemporary conversations. Thank you.
Welcome, Doug. How are you?
Thank you, very well.
Thank you for your time today.
Pleasure.
And taking the time out.
No problem.
Before we delve into the work you have, what you're doing and your views on so many things, could I ask you to give us a brief story about you,
Sure.
your background and your experience, and how has the leadership evolved?
Absolutely. My working life has been in the not-for-profit sector. I started out working on the inner city streets of Sydney with homeless people who were sleeping rough as a community development worker, and then transitioned into a whole lot of roles since then. And my working life has traversed community services, philanthropy, social and economic development, whole range of environments here and internationally. And now I find myself with the Smith family, a 103-year-old Australian not-for-profit organisation.
Could I also, as you have worked in different environments, from the streets to philanthropic and it's a wide range of work, how has your purpose evolved? And why do you think what you do is why you do?
Over time, I think I've had a very consistent thread of purpose throughout my working life, and that's really been about helping people realise full potential, giving more people opportunities. From working on the streets to working with young people in schools and all the other work I've done, I just see extraordinary potential in all people, just not the same level of opportunities. And so that's been my purpose for all of my working life and my voluntary life. I sit on boards and I volunteer in a whole lot of environments. So that's been very consistent. I think over time, as you get more experienced and different levels of responsibility, I think you learn more about leadership. I think I've also developed over time a focus on developing other leaders. And so a lot of my work today is about helping people realise their leadership potential. Because the more leaders we have, the more our organisations are doing the right work at the right time. So that's been probably something of the last 10 to 15 years that's become much more important to me. And so I'm involved in training and coaching and mentoring because I see great value in doing that as well.
I think that is a fairly strong purpose in developing other leaders and passing on the skills. In your observation, because in the not-for-profit sector, empathy has been talked about a lot, leadership with empathy. And all the upcoming leaders you are interacting with, what kind of skill sets you have to work more on versus which they already bring to the table?
Look, I think when we're talking about leadership, I always try to differentiate between leadership and management. They're two very important things for people who are running organisations, but I think you need to pull them out and think about what's required for each in terms of skills and mindsets and what context best suits those things. So obviously, from a management perspective, I'm always looking for character and competence. So people who are full of integrity, good ethics, but are competent in being a good manager. Know what's required to do the work technically. But I'm also wanting people who are really good leaders, people who can help us think about where we need to be next have a vision for the future, and importantly, discern that vision with others and find a way to realising that. There's a great quote that says that management is about doing things right and leadership is about doing the right thing. And so those two things are things that I'm always looking for. And what I think people most struggle with, honestly, is more leadership than management. People often think that there's a secret sauce or there's a special X factor required in leadership, and there honestly isn't. I've worked with leaders, global leaders, in all sorts of contexts. And in reality, we're all working out what it takes to be a good leader. And it's really about being authentically you in terms of the vision you have for the work at hand and bringing people around to realise that together.
The care sector is fairly diverse in Australia.
Hugely.
And the funding streams as well.
Yes.
You have to be working with different governing bodies, whether they're state or federal. And when you work through Smith Family on different kind of funding streams or multi-services portfolio you have, how do you see the connection between across funding streams, and how do you interact with these bodies?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And, I've worked in aged care, disability, community services, early learning, and now I'm working in education. So I'm very cognizant of all those different funding streams and how much that's changed in the last 10 to 15 years. Big changer from my perspective is consumer-directed funding. We've now created competitive markets. We have deregulated aged care and disability and early learning. So huge changes. I myself now work more in the space of private funding. So 85% of the Smith family's income comes from non-government sources. So that's a different model altogether. I think what's consistent across every type of funding stream is the need to focus on efficiency and effectiveness. What's most important is effectiveness, which for me is about outcomes. How are you working to ensure that you are improving quality of life and life outcomes for the people that you're there to serve? If you can't demonstrate that with evidence in whatever way is relevant for that context, then you've got to ask harder questions. And that's about putting the person you're here for right at the centre of your work and demonstrating that and showing how you're improving at that. So effectiveness matters, but so does efficiency. We've got to be really good stewards of resources wherever they come from.
Yeah.
If they come from government, I'm also a taxpayer, so I want to make sure that they're being used to best ends. And when we look at demographic changes, ageing population, higher level of acuity and need and the like, increasingly we're going to have to think about more effectiveness in how we work and being more productive with our time, our team members' time, and using technology and other resources to be much more effective. So, agnostic on funding, focus on efficiency and effectiveness.
And how do you see when many of the funding streams are linked to outputs and as a function, it's good to work on outcomes. But the reporting happens on outputs.
It does.
And how do we shift the mindset, not just from the sector who are leading those outcome-based work, but from a public service and political point of view? How do you bring that, close the loop on outcomes?
That's right. Look, I think there's more and more work happening with government in thinking about outcomes, and there's different types of funding models now tied to outcomes. So I think there is progress on that front. But fundamentally, not-for-profits are independent organisations. We're responsible for our own work. We're accountable to our members and to the wider community for the funds that we use. So ultimately, our focus on outcomes is for our own benefits to demonstrate our reason for existence and comes back to demonstrating our purpose. So it's almost funding requirements are really important, but we have an obligation to the wider community to report on those, and that should be our first and foremost driver in terms of demonstrating the level of the impact that we're creating.
Most of the not-for-profits would not have more than 80% of their funding from private spaces.
That's right. In fact, it's the reverse.
Yes. There would be state and federal, and everybody's trying to diversify. And that philanthropic wallet is that much. How does organizations who are on the journey of trying to diversify not just the portfolio of services, but portfolio funding sources.
Yeah.
From government to non-government sources.
Yes.
What are the key things the board and the
Yes.
executive should be having on the table to discuss and before they go on that journey?
Yeah. Diversification, I've looked at various reports in recent years, and AICD and others, when they talk about what is the board talking about the most, and the diversification is always top three in terms of board conversations about strategy. And look, my view on diversification is being really clear on diversification of sources of revenue, but don't diversify your business model too much, because you create huge risks and complexity. So if you're really good at providing services in a consumer-directed care environment, focus on diversifying sources to meet with that business model. If you're good at providing contracted services to the government, do that. So I think you've got to be very careful on the unintended consequences of too much diversification, and stay focused on a really integrated business model, but think about the diverse sources within that. For people interested in private revenue as a means as well, philanthropy and fundraising and the like, which is only about 10% of total revenue into the not-for-profit sector, so it's not a lot.
Yeah.
But the beauty of that type of money is there's much higher risk appetite, particularly if you think about philanthropy in that context. So often people think about forming more philanthropic partnerships because they've got an appetite for innovation, doing things differently. Yeah. And philanthropy is a great partner in doing that and looking at new ways of doing old work.
I have observed many organizations, when they go on a journey before philanthropy, they've tried fundraising.
Yes.
And then let's put up a gala dinner and then do fundraise. Because running events is not an internal skill set.
Yes.
And I've seen many people trying and failing.
Yeah.
And then, which in a way takes them away from that non-government sources of funding, because the first experience is we tried a gala, didn't work, all of that stuff, because they were not experts in running events, and that's probably, and they insourced the whole running a fundraiser, because that's another ball game.
Yes.
Staying to your core competencies is also important. So how do you see that kind of a behavior when people are wanting to diversify, but need to understand what's core competency as well?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and you do see it a lot, don't you? And so I think asking the why questions in terms of why diversify, and then if so, to what, and always leveraging off, in core capabilities and assets in the organisation, but also thinking broadly about your assets. If you've got a big membership base in some way, there's opportunities in that, or other types of assets within your organisation, hard or soft assets. I think it's important to think about those things as a key point as where you might want to diversify. But I would just say, if you're particularly looking at moving into public fundraising, so think about philanthropy as one, and actually philanthropy is where there's the biggest growth in terms of revenue. Increasingly in general fundraising, what we see is more charities completing for a smaller pool of Australians. Fewer Australians are giving. It's just the average gift is increased because of philanthropy that's making the difference. So I would be wary about entering into public fundraising. I'm not to say don't do it, but I think you'll need a lot of time and you need deep pockets, because building a brand, shifting your brand from being, maybe working with government to then now also thinking about something where people want to give money to you, that's a very different type of brand. Yeah. And it takes a lot to shift a brand and the perception of a brand as being a means by which you might give funds. So I would do it carefully, not to say don't do it, but do it eyes wide open and really think about what resources you need to do it over the long term, because you won't see immediate results from that shift.
In terms of the work, what the Smith family does, could you talk about the few projects you're working on this year and you feel excited about to share? Yeah,
happy to. Lots going on in the Smith family. Like a lot of not-for-profits, we're also doing some work around AI. A couple of things in flight for us at the moment, and this is a good example. We were supported with philanthropy to do this work, which is great, and our philanthropic partner wanted to support us so that we could do some demonstration projects to support the wider not-for-profit sector, and so we're about to do some work on that. So we've got 3 digital co-workers currently being piloted in the organisation. They're working with the marketing team, working in payroll compliance, and also working with our frontline team members to help them with saving time so they can spend more time with the families that we're supporting. So they're, good things that we're learning a lot from.
Digital employee, essentially.
Yeah, co-worker, agent, exactly, those sorts of things. So created with AI. And then we've also been piloting with with another partner on an AI tutor for the students that we support, helping them lift their motivation and engagement with their education. So we're learning a lot about AI at the moment, as it's a particular priority. We're also doing a lot more with data, so both in terms of the opportunity and the risk. So I think we're learning a lot about cyber and the needs to put stronger controls in terms of how we use data in organisations and, then, if you like, the minimisation of data from a risk perspective, but also the opportunity. So we've got partnerships now with education departments across Australia where we've got shared data agreements where we're accessing in real time education department data about student profiles, student attendance, student achievement that helps us in better supporting our families. So that's a great opportunity with data, but also minimising the risk at the same time.
Can you talk about the digital co-worker you were talking about specifically for the families when they're interacting?
Yes.
So what was the premise here, and
Sure.
What are the outcomes you're planning to achieve from that project?
So that digital co-worker is called Sunny.
Sunny.
Sunny has been created because what we've realised, and we did a whole lot of use cases across the organisation because we really wanted to focus on ROI. Where if we're going to invest money, we want to make sure we're going to get a return. We realised that when our frontline workers are having a conversation with a family about their students, their child's education, it takes about 20 minutes to prepare for that conversation because they're going to different sources in the organisation, different CRMs, databases, sources of information. It takes 20 minutes to pull that together and then make the call. So Sunny does that instantaneously. So we've got about 300 frontline workers, 72,000 students. You do the maths, that's a lot of saving of time. So that's really about saving time so our team members can focus on the conversations and having more conversations with our families. So that's how we've developed that co-worker and agent to help us with effectively productivity, which is really what that's about.
I was watching this case study from the US in which there's an AI tutor / similar example being introduced to primary school kids. And the tool meets individual child where they're at in terms of their learning development. And kids learn faster, so they spend less time rather than the whole 8 hours. They spend 2 hours a day in terms of their learning outcomes, and then they can spend more time doing physical activities or sports and stuff. So what's the premise here?
So we work with a partner, an international education organisation, High Results, and they've developed an AI agent effectively that's focused on motivation and engagement. So this agent effectively has the curriculum embedded. It's when you engage with the agent, you're effectively engaging with an avatar. So it's a person that, to all intents and purposes, looks like a real person. We had 400 students that we work with participating in a trial with that agent. They're logging onto their computers. They're seeing Olivia. It's the name of this co-worker, this agent. And what Olivia is trying to do is to spark the interests of the student in the curriculum by understanding the interests of the student, connecting that to the curriculum, because we're trying to improve motivation and engagement, because we know motivation and engagement is a precursor to school attendance. It's a precursor to learning. So that's what we've been piloting with our partner and thinking about other ways of doing that, because we know in Australia that there's a 4 to 5 year gap in literacy and numeracy for a young person who experiences disadvantage. So there's a lot more support required. The challenge we've got is, given the size of the gap, the large numbers of those students, how do we scale up enough resources to support those young people? So that's why we're experimenting with technology and other means to try different things.
What's the initial feedback you're getting from the students?
It's been positive, yeah. So this is a Bayesian's trial. We've just been looking at that data, some promising early results. That's being written up, and then further conversations just to think about where we take that.
There are tools, also tools on social isolation and interaction.
Yes.
So are you trialing or implementing those kind of AI tools for a cohort which you're supporting?
We're focused on educational outcomes. There are some therapeutic tools that have been around companionship and the like. So certainly there's other organisations in that space and different sort of mental health organisations thinking about what can be done.
Yeah.
I know there's also lots of risks that are being explored in that area as well, in terms of young people and adults as well. And so that's always the thing that we're very conscious of. You know, AI is both, it's an incredible opportunity, but it's also a huge risk. Huge, you know, disruption, disinformation, displacement, all those things at a societal level. So that's why, you know, as we go into this work as an organisation, we're going in with very clear governance principles, very strong eye to the risks associated with all this work at the same time, but equally wanting to test opportunities at the same time.
You talked about cyber as well, because as you're trialing so many things, you need to be aware of cyber risks in many ways or form. The National AI Plan of Australia, which came in just lately, also talks about data sovereignty of some form. How do you see the idea of data sovereignty? Because you're working with multiple partners, sharing information of young people. How do you manage the data sovereignty within your organisation?
Are you talking about data sovereignty for Indigenous people in particular?
Not just particular with them, all people you're serving.
No, thank you. So yes, data sovereignty is very much top of mind for us because obviously we have enormous amounts of data, both from our donors' side. You know, we've got hundreds of thousands of supporters and data related to that, to them, and then all these families that we're supporting as well, and longitudinal data and quite important data. So we're very mindful of as to how we navigate that and involving our supporters and our families in that whole process and thinking about data sovereignty through that. We are specifically thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and data sovereignty. Because of some, I think, unique and special requirements there. So we're actively in a conversation with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory group to think about what that needs to look like going forward, and thinking about the cultural governance that needs to sit across our organisation as we think about data that comes from First Nations people. That's an incredibly important thing for us to be carefully navigating. 25% of the students that we support are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. So there's an extra level of obligation that we have for those communities.
Broadly, as an education sector, it is not a care sector, it's more of an education only. But it has some elements of caring for the individual. So it's similar to aged care or not early childhood, but aged care, disability of those lines. So how do you create the guardrails of either you draw the line, this is what we do, that is what we don't do. How do you understand both sides of the work, education and care? Do you keep them separate, or do you merge them together into one, or how do you define that for your organisation?
Good question. So we're focused on the point at which poverty intersects with education. That's the space that we operate in, and we've done a lot of work to kind of understand people's experience in that context, their individual experiences, the family context, the school environment, the broader ecosystem and policy environment. So very mindful of that, and what we're really focused on is addressing the family context because that has a big impact on a child's education. So we do that by providing financial support for education-related expenses. We have a family practice framework that supports parents and carers. A parent and a carer has a huge impact on a child's education, so we want to strengthen their capability in that regard. And then obviously partnering with schools. So, it's a pretty complex environment. There are many factors. So we really focus on a couple of key areas, and areas where we think we've got something that we can use and something that we've built up over time in terms of capability, resources, networks, and insights and data. So we leverage those, and that's in part what we're doing at the moment, thinking about our future strategy. Wanting to build on what we've got, but the world has changed so much.
Yes.
So we're also thinking about, okay, how do we need to adapt to this very different world that a young person is now growing up in.
The definition of poverty is fairly standard in terms of it is only output based. It's a number.
Yep.
But it is driven by many factors.
It is.
Where you're born, which family you're born in, people who you're supporting, how big is your extended family, how many friends you have. All that community comes into a play. And how do you, what do you think are the measures to define poverty, and how is it limiting or not limiting?
Yeah, so in Australia, the kind of the measure that's commonly used, that we use as well, is the Henderson poverty line, and 50% of median income is generally regarded as the point at which you measure someone's experience of poverty. What that tells us is someone's experience of income poverty, being a low income. That helps us understand one dimension of poverty, of course, and by that we know that there's about 700,000 children in Australia that are in households that are in low incomes or experiencing poverty. That's become particularly acute with cost of living pressures.
Yes.
And we see in very real terms how that impacts the families that we're supporting, with having to make impossible choices as to how they use their limited funds, which has a direct impact on a child's education, not being able to afford the sort of resources that are needed, and just the increased stress and mobility of families because of their experience of poverty. So that's kind of an important dimension. But of course there are others. You might think about there's a family's social capital. So the diverse array of relationships that they have or don't have that helps them think about their future and their child's future. So, young people that we're working up with, 70% of the families we work with have parents and carers that are unemployed. A young person's future is often enabled by a parent's own networks, professional networks, education networks that helps them navigate university, TAFE courses, or future employment. That's social capital. That's another dimension to think about in terms of poverty. But equally, access to essential resources and services, things like digital technology, which we think about as kind of the new frontier of poverty, the degree to which you can participate in a digital economy. 44% of the students that we support don't have access to a digitally connected laptop at home. And we know there's about 400,000 secondary students in Australia that are in the same situation. So that's another dimension to poverty that has a particular contemporary edge to it, and is obviously limiting in terms of a young person being able to realise their potential if they don't have those, being in an environment where there's resources, access to digital resources, but also that social capital and that network of relationships.
From a brief point of view, state government controls the education funding, and their brief is that all young kids should have the opportunity to equal education through public education model. With that brief in mind, there are people still falling through the cracks, not being involved with the education space for so many reasons. Where do the government draw the line? How much do they intervene and be involved, or waiting for not-for-profits and charities and philanthropists to support your kind of projects? What you're doing to Smith Family, to be the jelly, bring people around and then just fill the gap. So what do you see is the sweetest spot there? How far does the dollar go from a government point of view?
Yeah, exactly. And look, this has obviously been a big conversation in recent years with the recent commitment, in fact last year, of the Better Fairer Schools Agreement, which is the funds that go from the Commonwealth to the states for education. So that's been a positive step forward, and that's the, if you like, the resolution of the Gonski funding from the needs-based funding model from 14 years ago. So it's great that that's been resolved, although it will come in incrementally over time. And that's absolutely what we see on the ground. We have a system now that has the growth in the private sector in terms of education, but the lion's share of young people who experience disadvantage are in the public system and are in high numbers of they're in schools with high concentrations of disadvantaged students at the same time. So what we see is big opportunities to provide more supports for those schools with large numbers of disadvantaged students. And for us, it's about providing additional supports to what teachers and schools are doing, given the complexity of those students, given their high numbers of needs. And also, in education, there's only a certain amount that schools and teachers can do. They play a really important role, but what we're doing is influencing the household and the family, which play a really important role in education, and providing those additional resources, and doing things in careers education. So, one of the things that's very important in careers education is getting young people into workplaces so they understand different career opportunities. That's something that other parties can do in partnering of schools. That's a wonderful complement to the important work of schools and teachers.
What's the research done on the generational impact of poverty leading to lack of education? Then because this young person doesn't have the opportunity of education, will eventually might be a number in homelessness, might be another number in your people who are not employed, might be another number on who are receiving Centrelink support. So how can this work, education work, be seen specifically for people who are highly disadvantaged, be seen as not the problem of today to be solved, but a preventative work for the future numbers which will grow and grow?
Exactly. No, you're exactly right. So we know in Australia that a young person who experiences poverty is 3 times more likely to be an adult who experiences poverty unless they get the right support at the right time. And that's why we exist, and that's why other organisations do the work as well. So we're really focused on providing education-related supports as early as possible, because we know that some young people start school not ready. Now, they can be turned around with additional support, but it gets harder. But over time, without support, young people can disengage from education, not attend school, not achieve at school, and they increasingly run the risk of not completing school, and therefore big challenges for them in terms of future financial security, unless the right supports are provided early in life and in a staged way over time as well. And that's what we do. So we run a number of early years programs that are very focused on literacy and numeracy in those early years, and then a range of those supports from K through to 12, so that we can try and remove some of those barriers that come up in family life that have an impact on a child's education, and that are very unfortunately characteristic of families that experience poverty.
The early childhood and education sector, which is the daycare and the childcare sector, officially known as early childhood and education and care. But there are 2 elements: early childhood education and care. So there's a responsibility of care and the responsibility of education.
There is.
Both sits together. And early identification of all the disadvantages can happen starting from there, and and handing over the knowledge and information to the next entity who will care for or educate the young person. So one is, how do you see the handover, and then second, that is it the work happening from identification of those disadvantages very early in the life journey?
No, there's a lot more to do in those early years. Some positive reforms of late with with subsidies and removing activity tests and the like, which is great because they've been real barriers for accessing early childhood education and care, and it's a bit of a reframing on what that system is in a sense. And I would say it's absolutely about education, not about workforce participation. So good to see those reforms, and that will hopefully lead to more families accessing those programs. As well as the funding now that's building more early learning centres, particularly where in communities we know there are these what they call childcare deserts. So limited numbers of centres, because the old model didn't stack up in terms of building it and to building those centres. So hopefully that will change. That will be incredibly important. We also know, though, that the barriers to early childhood education and care are not just financial; they're often cultural and relate to the family's education. So many families that aren't engaging in this system could be Indigenous families. They can be migrant families and refugee families, or just families that are experiencing poverty and disconnected from local communities. So there's more work to do in ensuring that more of those families are engaged. I'm certainly aware of programs that are being piloted that help do more proactive outreach to those families, but also help them with navigating systems to access the supports that they need. And so that work is incredibly important, because we know that every dollar you spend in the first 5 years of a child's life has a $7 payback over time in terms of ultimate benefit. So there's more to do in getting that right.
Because I think the education is a key element, and then if you talk about from secondary schooling to the vocational education or the higher education, because again, different departments, different funding sources, or different support mechanisms being laid, whether it's federal or state-based. How does, again, the question is, how does the handover or understanding of information on disadvantage, to just oversimplify case management, how is that managed, or is it there or not there?
Yeah. The transition from secondary school into further education employment is a really critical one. It's something that's exercising our minds because the labour market is just changing so much.
You're right.
In Australia, you think about the role of manufacturing has changed, you think about the shift to a knowledge-based economy, and now you think about AI, which will arguably remove a lot of those entry-level roles that previously would have existed, which are kind of stepping stones into employment. And then think too about casualisation of the service economy. So it has changed so much. So there's a lot more to do to help young people and families understand the different labour market and understand the different pathways into that new labour market. So we've been doing a lot in careers education, both in terms of looking at where careers education needs to be provided, which schools, which communities, but also looking at the best practices in careers education so that we can prepare young people for that future. Another really important thing is, just thinking about school completion. Our school completion rates are at they've dropped in the order of 7% over the last 8 to 10 years. So it's very low, and obviously COVID has impacted things, but actually school completion was dropping before COVID. So school completion is really important. We know that a lot of the new jobs in the new economy require tertiary qualifications from TAFE or university, which is why completing school is important to think about those pathways. So much more to do in that work. We're doing a lot of work at the moment in piloting different types of support that we can provide to our young people that we support. That's actually about helping them understand first the new, what TAFE and universities like, and the different things that they can access to ensure that they choose the right course, but also so that they complete their course if they get through school, and thinking about tertiary completion, because the completion rates, particularly in universities, are very low as far as education. So there's much more to do to support a young person through that education experience. And there's data that tells us that 8 to 9 out of 10 jobs of that new economy require tertiary qualifications. So it's really important they complete school and get onto that pathway.
I think people like you and me have we had the opportunity to have the entry-level roles. And we had our manager. So I had my manager who would tell me this is wrong, this is right. And I was then I became the next position, and there was somebody to educate and mentor from a work point of view and tell us what is wrong. And whereas there's young people who are coming in who might not have that traineeship or internship opportunities because AI might have taken those roles in those sectors as co-workers in digital space. So because we know what is right, so as an output which comes out of AI, I know what is right or wrong. Whereas because people have mentored and spent time on me in the last 25 years. So if I never had that, I would not know what's right or wrong. But that is an indirect mentoring from my bosses and managers. So how do you see that that mentoring gap being filled for the younger people? That might be another point of disadvantage.
It's a really good point, and honestly, we're figuring this out, particularly as we understand the impacts of AI. I mean, there has been good work in recent times looking at this whole notion of placement poverty, and the Commonwealth has put more funding into this, particularly for nurses and social workers and teachers, which is excellent, because one thing that has been identified is we know that an internship or placement is a precursor to employment, but if you're a young person who experiences poverty, that costs money. To get to that place, you may need to stop your part-time job to do it. So there's been good government support to think that through, which is excellent. I sit on the board of Western Sydney University. I think university sectors are thinking very differently about their role in the future. With the advent of AI, other kind of changes in the funding environment, and I think increasingly they are thinking about stronger integrations with industry, because they realise having those industry experiences early in your tertiary education is really important for kind of getting the sort of things you would normally get from internships and mentoring as a pathway into employment. So I think you'll see that whole system and that whole sector change significantly over time as they adapt to a very different environment.
One thing which I have observed across the care economy or care and support sector, including education, is that every sector is a silo on their own.
Yes.
They are their own island, but struggling with the same problems.
Yes, true.
So the workforce is a common conversation. Heavy governance is another common conversation. Inequality and safeguarding standards, another conversation. And it's very similar problem statements we are trying to answer, and we might be, our outcomes are very similar also, what we want to achieve for our participants or clients or end users. Do you think there's a possibility of bringing the whole care sector and the education sector on the same platform? Because there is a person as a whole, I might have a disability and the education. I might have some kind of disadvantage in terms of poverty, still need education and have disability. So there's an overlap of so many government funding streams I might interact with on a regular basis. So what do you see the coming together of multiple sectors as a conversation to be had?
Look, absolutely. I think there's certainly a case for that. I mean, the kind of points of separation really relate to practice and clinical governance. I mean, the types of practice as it relates to provide the provision of supports and disability services relative to residential aged care, they are quite different in nature. So there are some key differences that require those streams to have that specialisation. But there's kind of back-end resources, capability, functions that sit underneath that that are broadly applicable across those different streams. I think that's where the opportunity certainly is in terms of that core infrastructure and support and services, and things like rostering. That's a core platform. You can differentiate in some areas, but you can also look at common platforms as well that can sit across those different functions. And look, some of the bigger organisations that are quite diversified, they're already doing that. They're looking at those core systems that traverse all they do, but then also being mindful of not overreaching in that and working out where the boundaries are to that, so that they don't dilute the quality of the services that they're providing to those unique cohorts of population groups.
In conclusion, if you can draw me a picture of a time when all young kids in Australia have equal opportunity for education everywhere.
Yes. No, look, that's certainly the future that we're working towards. That's absolutely our vision. And, the thing that's driving that, and I see this in my work every day, is just the extraordinary potential that I sit in the young people that I meet with and that we work with. That potential is what we need for the future economic adaptations that we need to make as a nation. We need more young people participating in the economy and in society. We have an ageing population. We need more taxpayers. So there's great benefits in making those investments. Benefits for those individuals, benefits for those families, increased financial security, and much stronger benefits for our nation. So, I think there's huge opportunities. There's no doubt there's challenges, but a lot of really positive work that we can do on the ground in communities and as well as getting the policy settings right so that we can set things in place to, have a thriving economy and thriving society and families and young people right at the centre of all that.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.